Today, joining me on the show is Harper Harwell. Harper is a reporter for the Birmingham Business Journal, and this week published a story titled Alabama's Corporate Giants Urge to Boost Startup Scene and Follow Atlanta's Lead. First and foremost, welcome to the show, Harper.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be here.
Yeah, appreciate it. I will admit, I think this is an article that should have been written several times over the last 5 to 10 years, and I was really excited to see that you wrote it. It was a very well written piece. I think that it couldn't have been an easy piece to write, and we'll get into that. But just for background, for anybody who doesn't know, this idea of the big companies in Alabama participating either as investors in or as customers of startups in Alabama has been a real source of frustration in the startup community for a lot of years. They represent a lot of kind of capital access. They represent certainly large contracts potentially for those startups. And it's always kind of felt a little difficult, if not impossible, to get in those corporations for those customer contracts, or to have conversations about them investing directly or through funds that invest in those startup ecosystems. So, first and foremost, congratulations on getting the article done, because I can't imagine that was super easy to write.
Thank you. Yeah, I definitely had some obstacles, but it was a fun one to write just because of the challenge and because I had heard from a lot of people in the community that they had been expressing these frustrations for a while. And I think they were happy to see it in print and see it given a somewhat public platform. So it was a fun one to write. I enjoyed it.
And as a note of fairness, I think it's important to say there are a few that participate in investing directly in or indirectly into startups, as well as serve as customers, some first customers or early customers. And those companies that are doing that are doing it fairly regularly. The problem appears to be that there's just only a couple that do, and everybody else kind of sits on the sidelines. But I think it's important to note that there are some, and they have been pretty active over the last 5 to 10 years. But let's start with why corporate investment, corporate participation as customers for early stage startups. Why is that so important in Alabama?
I think first and foremost, it gives our startups a way to grow and a way to get that investment and that acknowledgement. We have so many amazing resources for early stage startups, incubators, accelerator programs, pitch competitions in Birmingham and across the state. But I think for those middle to later stage startups that are ready to scale, ready to grow, have gone to market, have kind of fine-tuned their service or product, they need more interaction. They need more investment. And I think, while those accelerators and all those other resources are amazing, they can't offer the amount of investment or help that I think a corporation could help or could give a startup to help them grow and scale.
You used Atlanta's Engage program as an example of how corporate involvement could work in a startup ecosystem. When you were looking at that program, can you talk a little bit about what it is and kind of the impact that it's had?
Yeah, so the Engage Fund is a consolidated venture capital fund with that 14 Fortune 5 companies, either based in Atlanta or the surrounding areas, funnel money into. So corporations like Chick-fil-A, Home Depot, Delta Airlines, huge names in the business world, they are putting venture capital investment into this fund, and then startups in the area in Atlanta and throughout the Southeast can pull from that fund, get mentorship, get investment, and just get their feet under them. And I think the most important part of it is that it's a consolidated fund, and it helps bridge the gap of communication and access between startups and those large corporations.
Now, the Engage program doesn't account for all of the numbers I'm about to share, but in the article, you reference some PitchBook data. And for anybody out there who doesn't know, PitchBook is kind of one of the big venture capital private investment industry information sources. They consolidate a bunch of disparate data points, and they make reports on it. And so they kind of report on a state-by-state basis a couple of different numbers, one of which is how much total venture capital deal value happened in any given period of time. It's quarterly and then obviously rolls up into an annual report. And in that, you talked about Georgia and Tennessee booked 1.3 billion and 3.4 billion respectively in total venture investment in 2024, while Alabama showed a mere $81 million. So just so we're not confusing millions and billions, I'm going to say that again. So 1.3 billion and 3.4 billion for Georgia and Tennessee respectively, and $81 million in Alabama for all of 2024. So I want to say this, that I believe last year's numbers for Alabama were a bit of an anomaly that is historically incredibly low as you look at it across the last 10 years. But those numbers are downright depressing if you're looking at it from a startup's point of view, saying, I'm trying to raise money and there's not much venture activity. So now that you've spent some time really understanding that delta, that gap, what role do you think the startup community should expect corporations to play in trying to close that gap?
I think it definitely shouldn't be charity or philanthropy. I think startups who think or, say they want that corporate interaction, they need to be prepared to provide, great results and great numbers for those large corporates. They're large companies because they've been focused on internal efficiencies and internal business practices for so long, and that's helped them grow. So the only way or reason that they're going to reach out externally to a startup is if a startup can make one of their processes more efficient, or help solve a problem that the business is facing. So startup founders need to be prepared to deliver great results and deliver great numbers, or else corporates aren't going to care, because their main focus is making their business the most profitable and most efficient business it can be.
Just a quick time out to ask you if you'd please hit that subscribe button. 88% of people who watch our videos are not subscribed to our channel. So if you want the latest on startup news, technology, innovation, or even just business discussions, click that subscribe button. Promise to give you some good content, one long form video a week and several shorts along the way. Hit that subscribe button. Help us reach our goal of 5 new subscribers every single week. Thanks so much.
I'm going to ask you to polish off your crystal ball here, but what happens, in your opinion, if that delta doesn't start to shrink, or at least Alabama starts to be more competitive from a venture capital attraction and deployment standpoint, given the fact that, Atlanta and Nashville, which are effectively the hubs for Georgia and Tennessee's venture ecosystem, what happens if, and those are just like 2.5 hours away, what happens if that gap doesn't start to close, or at least we get more competitive?
I mean, people already overlook A, the Southeast, but B, more importantly, Alabama, when thinking about startup action, when thinking about venture capital investment. So I think if, larger names and larger companies that are based here don't start saying, hey, we have great startup companies here and we're investing in them because they're great startup companies, you should invest in them too. People are going to continue overlooking us. No one thinks that someone in Birmingham, Alabama has a great scalable, $1 billion company, or, even $1 million company ready to grow. But if large corporations that already are on a national or global stage are saying, hey, we're investing in them, y'all should too, I think, people are just going to keep passing over Alabama and thinking, oh, well, that's nothing but a bunch of farms and cornfields,
Something that I think has been part of the ongoing frustration with all of this is that it feels like from the startup perspective, or the startup ecosystem perspective, it feels like a lot of the corporations are playing a very kind of short-term game, meaning that, investment specifically in startups is very risky. No one argues that. And they have a responsibility to their shareholders. They have a responsibility to their stakeholders, to their employees, to their business model. At the same time, though, if the ecosystem isn't building from an entrepreneurial standpoint, the question becomes, are we really going to grow at all? Or are we going to just watch more legacy industries like mining, like steel production, some of the old world industries get smaller and smaller and smaller, get less and less locally owned, see more and more of the profits go out of state? I think part of the frustration comes from, if we're not building the next generation of industries, if those corporations aren't literally willing to put some risk capital forward to make sure that we have those opportunities going forward, it feels a little bit like, well, you're just going to make the money you can make off of the ecosystem and the business community as it exists today. And hopefully that lasts forever. But again, you have these folks on the other side of the equation in the startup world going, well, yeah, but all these legacy industries are just getting smaller. And there's fewer and fewer banks. There's fewer and fewer of everything that really built kind of the business community and the revenue basis for a lot of Alabama. What would you say to people who are going, I'm tired of this short game. I really wish these guys would look a little bit longer term. Are they right, or are they just only kind of stuck in their own thought process?
I mean, I think there's a balance, but I think, what we've seen and what I've heard from a lot of people in the community is that Birmingham startup community hasn't really been growing much until the last 5 or 10 years. And, that took 5 or 10 years for us to get us to where we are. So I think people need to understand that what I've heard from a lot of my sources is that, it is going to take possibly another 5, 10, 15, however many years to get us to the scale that maybe, Nashville or Atlanta are. Not like we want to be just like them, but, similarly, we want to grow and be a hub for venture capital investment and startups to succeed. And I think a lot of large corporations are based on that, short-term returns type of model. And that makes sense. That's why they're successful. But, they need to be talking or thinking about that long-term return. And, working with a startup is going to probably take a long time for you to see those returns, at least monetarily, but they could make your processes more efficient. They could make they could fix a problem that you've been consistently dealing with within your internal structure and you don't know why. A startup could have the solution to that, but if you're not looking for it and not being interested in it and interacting with the startup community, you're never going to know how a local startup can help you make your business more efficient.
I also thought that Miller Gervin, who heads up the EDPA, was quoted in the article, and I liked her take. Honestly, it was a little hard to read. It was a little hard to internalize, but that doesn't make her wrong. Actually made her very right, which is the kind of calling out that this is a two-way street. That if you are expecting to do business as a startup with a large company, you need to be prepared. You need to have your ducks in a row. You need to be able to deliver, to your point, on the contract that you land, on the commitments that you've made, in the regulatory environment that you may have to sell into. And so it should never be this idea that the corporates of Alabama owe us these contracts or owe us this investment. I think simultaneously, there is a responsibility on the corporate side to tell those startups very clearly and very succinctly under which circumstances are you going to do business with a startup. And also, if you're not going to do business with a startup, just say that. It's not in your business model. It's not something you're interested. Kind of move on. It felt like you got a fairly balanced perspective on that. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it needs to be a two-way street. It shouldn't be charity. Not every startup founder or startup model is going to work for a large corporate and work with a large corporate. That relationship is obviously comes with a lot of pressure, not only because you have to deliver those results and deliver those numbers, but also because it's going to get your name out there and you might get, attraction from other large companies and other businesses. So you need to be prepared to scale and provide those things. And I just think sometimes what I've heard is that we're in the Southeast, we have that Southern hospitality. We're just too nice to our startup founders sometimes. And there are so many amazing startup founders here. I interact with them a lot. Everyone I've met is phenomenal, but not every business is meant to work with a large corporate. And I think that needs to be kind of more hit home for certain founders for sure.
Despite the rise of digital within the journalistic space, column inch is still a thing, or word count is still a thing. Were there any things that didn't make the article that had you had a little bit more space or a little bit more time, or just budgeted column inches that you would have liked to share that you thought was additive to your article?
I think the first thing is that venture capital investment isn't the only way that large corporates can get involved with our startup community. Like you said, mentorship, feedback, working with a startup and using their product or service for 6 months or a year, and then come, at the end of that saying, hey, these are the things that work really well. These are the things that you need to tweak and fine tune and improve on. That's so helpful for a startup, because a lot of these startups are coming in, they've had some customers, but a large corporation is a very different type and structure of customer than probably a lot of these startup founders have dealt with. So that mentorship and that feedback can be formative and transformative for startups. And also, I think it's really important to remind people that the startup founders here are eager. They want blood. They're ready to get their feet on the ground and, provide those results. And especially the ones that want to work with corporates, they hopefully are prepared to give those. They're going to give you the best customer service because everything that they've built is on the line. So I think corporations need to remind themselves that, once you find a founder that, you like, and their startup is something that you could implement at your company, ideally they'll give you the best service because they have the most to lose.
Harper Harwell from the Birmingham Business Journal, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for this article.
Yeah, thanks for having me.